The popular view of life in ancient Egypt is often that it was a death-obsessed culture in which powerful pharaohs forced the people to labor at constructing pyramids and temples and, at an unspecified time, enslaved the Hebrews for this purpose. In reality, ancient Egyptians loved life, no matter their social class, and the ancient Egyptian government used slave labor as every other ancient culture did without regard to any particular ethnicity. The ancient Egyptians did have a well-known contempt for non-Egyptians, but this was simply because they believed they were living the best life possible in the best of all possible worlds. Life in ancient Egypt was considered so perfect, in fact, that the Egyptian afterlife was imagined as an eternal continuation of life on Earth. Slaves in Egypt were either criminals, those who could not pay their debts, or captives from foreign military campaigns. These people were considered to have forfeited their freedoms either by their individual choices or by military conquest, and so were forced to endure a quality of existence far below that of free Egyptians. The individuals who actually built the pyramids and other famous monuments of Egypt were Egyptians who were compensated for their labor, and, in many cases, were masters of their art. These monuments were raised not in honor of death, but of life, and the belief that an individual life mattered enough to be remembered for eternity. Further, the Egyptian belief that one's life was an eternal journey and death only a transition inspired the people to try to make their lives worth living eternally. Far from a death-obsessed and dour culture, Egyptian daily life was focused on enjoying the time one had as much as possible and trying to make others' lives equally memorable. Sports, games, reading, festivals, and time with one's friends and family were as much a part of Egyptian life as toil in farming the land or erecting monuments and temples. The world of the Egyptians was imbued with magic. Magic, Heka, predated the gods, and in fact was the underlying force which allowed the gods to perform their duties. Magic was personified in the god Heka, also the god of medicine, who had participated in the creation and sustained it afterwards. The concept of Ma'at, harmony and balance, was central to the Egyptians' understanding of life and the operation of the universe, and it was Heka which made Ma'at possible. Through the observance of balance and harmony, people were encouraged to live at peace with others and contribute to communal happiness. Letting one's face shine meant being happy, having a good spirit, in the belief that this would make one's own heart light and lighten those of others. Although Egyptian society was highly stratified from a very early period, as early as the pre-dynastic period in Egypt of 6000 to 3150 BCE, this does not mean that the royalty and upper classes enjoyed their lives at the expense of the peasantry. The king and court are always the best documented individuals because then, as now, people paid more attention to celebrities than their neighbors, and the scribes who recorded the history of the time documented what was of greater interest. Still, reports from later Greek and Roman writers, as well as archaeological evidence and letters from different time periods, show that Egyptians of all social classes valued life and enjoyed themselves as often as they could, very like people in the modern day. Population and social classes. The population of Egypt was strictly divided into social classes, from the king at the top, his vizier, the members of his court, regional governors, eventually called nomarchs, the generals of the military, after the period of the New Kingdom, government overseers of work sites, supervisors, and the peasantry. Social mobility was neither encouraged nor observed for most of Egypt's history, as it was thought that the gods had decreed the most perfect social order which mirrored that of the gods. The gods had given the people everything and had set the king over them as the one best equipped to understand and implement their will. The king was the intermediary between the gods and the people from the pre-dynastic period through the Old Kingdom, circa 2613 to 2181 BCE, when the priests of the sun god Ra began to gain more power. Even after this, however, the king was still considered God's chosen emissary. Even the latter part of the New Kingdom, 1570 to 1069 BCE, when the priests of Ammon at Thebes held greater power than the king, the monarch was still respected as divinely ordained. Upper class. The king of Egypt, as the god's chosen man, enjoyed great wealth and status unimaginable to the majority of the population. It was the king's responsibility to rule in keeping with Ma'at, and, as this was a serious charge, he was thought to deserve those luxuries in keeping with his status and the weight of his duties. The king is often depicted hunting, and inscriptions regularly boast of the number of large and dangerous animals a particular monarch killed during his reign. Almost without exception, though, animals like lions and elephants were caught by royal game wardens and brought to preserves, where the king then hunted the beasts while surrounded by guards who protected him. The king would hunt in the open for the most part, only once the area had been cleared of dangerous animals. Members of the court lived in similar comfort, although most of them had little responsibility. The nomarchs might also live well, but this depended on how wealthy their particular district was and how important to the king. The nomarch of a district including a site like Abydos, for example, would expect to do quite well, because of the large necropolis there dedicated to the god Osiris, which brought many pilgrims to the city, including the king and courtiers. A nomarch of a region which had no such attraction would expect to live more modestly. The wealth of the region and the personal success of an individual nomarch would determine whether they lived in a small palace or a modest home. This same model applied generally to scribes. Scribes and physicians. Scribes were valued highly in ancient Egypt as they were considered specially chosen by the god Thoth, who inspired and presided over their craft. Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson notes how the power of the written word to render permanent a desired state of affairs lay at the heart of Egyptian belief and practice. It was the scribe's responsibility to record events so they would become permanent. The words of the scribes etched daily events in the record of eternity, since it was thought that Thoth and his consort Seshat kept the scribe's words in the eternal libraries of the gods. A scribe's work made him immortal not only because later generations would read what they wrote, but because the gods themselves were aware of it. Seshat, patron goddess of libraries and librarians, carefully placed one's work on her shelves, just as librarians in her service did on Earth. Most scribes were male, but there were female scribes who lived just as comfortable as their male counterparts. A popular piece of literature from the Old Kingdom, known as Duoph's Instructions, advocates a love for books and encourages young people to pursue higher learning and become scribes in order to live the best life possible. All priests were scribes, but not all scribes became priests. The priests needed to be able to read and write to perform their duties, especially concerning mortuary rituals. As doctors needed to be literate to read medical texts, they began their training as scribes. Most diseases were thought to be inflicted by the gods as punishment for sin or to teach a lesson, and so doctors needed to be aware of which god, or evil spirit, or ghost, or other supernatural agent might be responsible. In order to perform their duties, they had to be able to read the religious literature of the time, which includes works on dentistry, surgery, the setting of broken bones, and the treatment of various illnesses. As there was no separation between one's religious and daily life, doctors were usually priests until later in Egypt's history when there is a secularization of the profession. All of the priests of the goddess Serket were doctors, and this practice continued even after the emergence of more secular physicians. As in the case of scribes, women could practice medicine, and female doctors were numerous. In the 4th century BCE, Adnodice of Athens famously traveled to Egypt to study medicine since women were held in higher regard and had more opportunity there than in Greece. Military. The military prior to the Middle Kingdom was made up of regional militias conscripted by nomarchs for a certain purpose, usually defense, and then sent to the king. At the beginning of the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom, Amenemhat I, circa 1991 to circa 1962 BCE, reformed the military to create the first standing army, thus decreasing the power and prestige of the nomarchs and putting the army directly under his control. After this, the military was made up of upper-class leaders and lower-class rank-and-file members. There was the possibility of advancement in the military, which was not affected by one's social class. Prior to the New Kingdom, the Egyptian military was primarily concerned with defense, but pharaohs like Thutmose III, 1458 to 1425 BCE, and Ramesses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, led campaigns beyond Egypt's borders in expanding the empire. Egyptians generally avoided travel to other lands because they feared that, if they should die there, they would have greater difficulty reaching the afterlife. This belief was a definite concern of soldiers on foreign campaigns, and provisions were made to return the bodies of the dead to Egypt for burial. There is no evidence that women served in the military, or, according to some accounts, would have wanted to. The papyrus Lansing, to give only one example, describes life in the Egyptian army as unending misery leading to an early death. It should be noted, however, that scribes, especially the author of the papyrus Lansing, consistently depicted their job as the best and most important, and it was the scribes who left behind most of the reports on military life.
Farmers and laborers. The lowest social class was made up of peasant farmers who did not own the land they worked or the homes they lived in. The land was owned by the king, members of the court, nomarchs, or priests. A common phrase of the peasants to start the day was, "Let us work for the noble." The peasants were almost all farmers, no matter what other trade they cultivated, ferrymen, for example. They planted and harvested their crops, gave most of it to the landowner, and kept some for themselves. Most had private gardens, which women tended while the men went out to the fields. Up until the time of the Persian invasion of 525 BCE, the Egyptian economy operated on the barter system and was based on agriculture. The monetary unit of ancient Egypt was the deben, which, according to historian James C. Thompson, functioned much as the dollar does in North America today to let customers know the price of things, except that there was no deben coin. A deben was approximately 90 grams of copper. Very expensive items could also be priced in debens of silver or gold, with proportionate changes in value. The lowest class of society produced the goods used in trade and therefore provided the means for the entire culture to thrive. These peasants also made up the labor force which built the pyramids and other monuments of Egypt. When the Nile River flooded its banks, farming became impossible, and the men and women would go to work on the king's projects. This work was always compensated, and the claim that any of the great structures of Egypt were built by slave labor, especially the claim of the biblical book of Exodus that these were Hebrew slaves oppressed by Egyptian tyrants, is not supported by any literary or physical evidence at any time in Egypt's history. The claim by certain authors, such as Egyptologist David Rohl, that one misses the evidence of a mass enslavement of Hebrews by looking at the wrong time period is untenable, since no such evidence exists no matter what period of Egyptian history one examines. Work on monuments like the pyramids and their mortuary complexes, temples and obelisks provided the only opportunity for upward mobility of the peasantry. Especially skilled artists and engravers were in high demand in Egypt and were better paid than unskilled laborers who simply moved the stones for the buildings from one place to another. Peasant farmers could also improve their status by practicing a craft to provide the vases, bowls, plates, and other ceramics people needed. Skilled carpenters could make a good living creating tables, desks, chairs, beds, storage chests, and painters were required for decoration of upper-class homes, palaces, tombs, and monuments. Brewers were also highly respected, and breweries were sometimes run by women. In early Egyptian history, in fact, they seem to have been entirely operated by females. Beer was the most popular drink in ancient Egypt and was frequently used as compensation. Wine was never that popular except among royalty. Workers at the Giza Plateau were given a beer ration 3 times a day. The beverage was thought to have been given to the people by the god Osiris, and breweries were presided over by the goddess Tenenet. Beer was taken very seriously by the Egyptians, as the Greek pharaoh Cleopatra VII 69 to 30 BCE, learned when she imposed a beer tax. Her popularity plummeted more for this one tax than for her wars with Rome. The lower class could also find opportunity through work in metals, gems, and sculpting. The exquisite jewelry of ancient Egypt, gems mounted delicately in ornate settings, was created by members of the peasantry. These people, the majority of the Egyptian population, also filled the ranks of the army and, in rare cases, could become scribes. One's job and position in society, however, was usually handed down to one's son. Homes and furnishings. These artists were responsible for creating the furnishings for the lavish palaces, upper-class homes, and temples of Egypt, as well as the tombs, which were considered a person's eternal home. The king, his queen, and family lived in a palace which was richly decorated and had their needs tended to by servants. Scribes lived in or near the mortuary or temple complexes in special apartments and worked from scriptoriums, while, as noted, nomarchs lived in greater or lesser accommodations according to their level of success. The peasants who provided the food for the upper classes also helped build their homes and supply them with chests, drawers, chairs, tables, and beds, while they themselves could not afford any of these things. By contrast, the palace of the pharaoh Amenhotep III, 1386 to 1353 BCE, known as Malkata today, covered over 30,000 square meters, or 30 hectares, and included spacious apartments, conference rooms, audience chambers, a throne room and receiving hall, a festival hall, libraries, gardens, storerooms, kitchens, a harem, and a temple to the god Amun. The palace's outer walls were painted bright white, while the interior colors were vibrant blues and yellows and greens. The entire structure, of course, had to be furnished, and these articles were supplied by the lower-class workers. In its time, the palace was known as the House of Rejoicing and other similar names. It is known as Malkata today from the Arabic for place where things are picked up, owing to the massive debris field found there from the ruined palace. The apartments and homes of scribes, as with those of the nomarchs, were opulent or modest depending on their level of success and the region in which they lived. The author of the Papyrus Lansing, Nebmara Nakht, claimed to live in grand style and to own land and slaves on par with the great king. This claim is no doubt true too, as it is well established that priests were able to achieve the same level of wealth and power as some rulers in Egypt, and scribes would have had that same opportunity. Crime and punishment. In ancient Egypt, as in every era of human history, the wealth of one person was often coveted by another, who might choose to steal it, and in such cases, Egyptian law was swift. After the New Kingdom, there was a police force, but even before this time, people were brought before the local official and charged with crimes across the spectrum of criminal activity in the modern day. The state did not involve itself in local affairs unless the criminal had robbed or vandalized state property, such as robbing or defacing a tomb. Judgment and justice were ultimately the responsibility of the vizier, the king's right-hand man, who delegated that responsibility to officials beneath him, who further delegated to others. Even prior to the New Kingdom, there was an administrative building in any city called the Judgment Hall, where cases were heard and verdicts rendered. In small towns and villages, these courts might be held in the marketplace. The local court was known as the Kenbet, made up of community leaders of sound moral judgment who would hear cases and decide on guilt or innocence. In the New Kingdom, the Judgment Hall and the Kenbet were gradually replaced by oracular judgments, in which the god Amun would be consulted directly on a verdict. This was accomplished by a priest of Amun asking the statue of the god a question and then interpreting his answer through various means. Sometimes the statue would nod its head, and other times there would be different signs given. If the defendant was found guilty, then punishment was swift. Most punishments were fines for minor offenses, but rape, robbery, assault, murder or tomb robbing could result in mutilation, cutting off of the nose, ears, or hands, incarceration, forced labor, essentially slavery for life in many cases, or death. The Great Prison at Thebes held convicted felons who were used for manual labor on the Temple of Amun at Karnak and other projects. So, the next time you see a pyramid, I hope you'll remember it not as a tomb for the dead, but as a monument to the eternal life of a vibrant and joyful people. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive. If you did, a like on the video would be amazing, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss what we explore next. We've got a lot more history to uncover together. Thanks for your time, and stay curious.